I'm going to try to answer question 3 as an expert in English teaching, and obviously I'd be an expert student. And as usual, if you've seen videos 1 and 2, you'll know that I'm doing this to see how much of the marks is rewarded for being brilliant at the exam rather than being brilliant at English. And my prediction is that it will be 50%, half the marks, and not for how good you are at English, but for actually knowing the exam criteria. So here goes. In this section I'm going to have to read the whole text, but I read the first 7 lines and from 18 to the end in my previous 2 questions, so I already know this text quite well. And there's the ending, which I've also done in question 2. I remember that there are only 8 marks, and that means I can only really spend 8 minutes on this question. So there's this big fat space here, but there's also another extra page. This is misleading of the examiner. Most of you won't be able to write that much in 8 minutes, and you won't need to, I'm assuming. The mark scheme won't ask you to write that much. Right, the examiner does give us some really helpful advice. You've got to write about the whole source, and that means writing about the beginning and the end and stuff in the middle. So I'll put B for beginning, E for end, and M for middle. So I'm going to have to write about all those 3 things, and luckily there are 3 bullet points. So let's have a look at them. The writer focuses your attention at the beginning. Oh, that's lucky, so that's taken care of that. How and why the writer changes his focus at the extract as the extract develops. Well, that's going to be the middle. Focus has turned up twice, so I'm clearly going to have to use that word. And any other structural features that interest you. I wonder what those will be. I know, the ending. So I've got myself a method here. If I write about the beginning and the end and the middle, I'm always going to hit the 3 bullet points. Good. That means I only have to write about 3 things, these 3, and that's going to get me my 8 marks. Right, good news. Now, in the exam, I'm also trying to think inside the examiner's head. So this is the second time that the examiner has pointed out that the extract comes from the beginning of a novel. Consequently, I know that writers will include details to encourage the reader to make predictions. So I'm going to use that in my answer. It's also quite likely that the writer will play with these predictions, giving us new information that makes us think in a new way. This will probably always happen, and so this change of prediction is the same as change of focus in the question, and I always know that this will happen in any question that the examiner gives me, so I'll always be able to write about it. Another aspect of structure will be paragraphing, for example, paragraphs to surprise or emphasize, and paragraphs to load in detail. And this detail might be used to create rich, vivid pictures or to create tension. Now I know these things before I even read the extract. Mentally I'm prepared for these things to come up. I also remember to think visually like a film director, and the examiner has steered me this way by using the word focus, like a cameraman. So that some descriptions will use a wide angle or a narrow focus. This will give us a change in viewpoint or perspective, which might also affect the atmosphere or our predictions. And this will always be true. Writers will always change that wide angle or narrow focus. So I will always write about that in question 3, no matter what the extract is. I will also try to read the passage out loud in my head, because sound is important when the writer wants to speed up pace or slow the pace down, and this will be helped by a variety in sentence lengths. Obviously, lots of short sentences will speed up the action, and longer complex sentences are just simply longer to read and therefore slow the action down. Okay, and just to repeat, I do this as a mental check before I even look at the passage. These are the kinds of techniques that all writers use, and therefore I'm already thinking about them before I start answering the question. And you can do this too. It means that you've partly answered the question in your head before you even see the exam paper. And I know that some or all of these techniques must occur in this exam question, no matter what text the examiners choose. Okay, then when I look at the 3 bullet points, I see that I was correct. There will be a way to capture the reader's interest at the beginning, because the first bullet point tells me to look there, and the second bullet point suggests that there will be a change of focus, either wide angle or narrow, and the third bullet point is a gift to me as an exam candidate because it invites me to comment on anything I like, which is going to be the ending, remember, and of course to get the marks I will have to comment on the effect on the reader. So here is my answer that I did in real time. The novel opens with 4 single sentence paragraphs. The writer shows off her skills of description. They are a form of delaying the action, so that's the effect, perhaps to make us anticipate what might happen. And I think that's probably enough for your first paragraph, but obviously I'm able to write more quickly, and so I've added an alternative explanation which I know will get me into the top band. Alternatively, they could signal to the reader that we are in safe hands. We are going to enjoy a long and descriptive novel which may have been attractive to a reader in the early, that should say, 20th century, because it's written in 1936, isn't it? And I explained why such a long novel would be attractive in my previous video on question 2. And just to emphasise, you might not need the bit that I've underlined in blue. You might not even draw these conclusions from the fact that it was written in 1936, and you wouldn't have to put that detail in to get the full marks, but I can, so I did. If I'd got rid of the bit that was underlined in blue, then this first paragraph here would join to that previous paragraph to make one longer one. So the action actually begins in the 5th paragraph, which would make a far more engaging opening to the novel. The reference to Truro also helps us understand the geographical context. For this reason, the first 4 paragraphs are not needed to get us into the plot. So here I'm writing about the structure because I'm saying this could have been a better opening. Potential danger is also hinted at with the introduction of the passenger, who accuses the driver of being about to murder them. Again, the writer is practicing delay, so that's the effect of it, refusing to introduce us to the main character, who we now know is in danger. Here is the 5th paragraph, by the way, and this is where the action actually starts, and the bit of the paragraph that I've been talking about is the passenger who thrust his head out and shouted up to the driver, cursing him in a high and petulant voice for a rogue and a murderer. That's where I've got the idea that they're in danger from, and they were all going to die. They'd all be dead before they reached Bodmin if he persisted in driving at breakneck speed. So that's the accusation and this change of focus that suggests that they might be dead if things carry on as they are. When I look at the ending, I'm going to look at the change of focus on our main character Mary. She sat with her chin cupped in her hands, her eyes fixed on the window, splashed with mud and rain, hoping with a sort of desperate interest that some ray of light would break the heavy blanket of sky, and but a momentary trace of that lost blue heaven that had mantled Helford yesterday shine for an instant as a forerunner of fortune, and I'm going to concentrate on this move away from the weather onto this idea of good luck, good fortune, which might also involve wealth. So here is that paragraph. Mary does not appear alarmed, so we know this danger is not real. That's the danger that the passenger was yelling about, but a sign that other dangers lie ahead. So it's a kind of a clue. Not the danger of the coach ride, because that's the beginning of the novel, therefore there must be other dangers. And for this reason, the final paragraph focuses on her seeking her fortune, which might imply a pursuit of wealth, or of happiness, or perhaps marriage, because this is, after all, set in the 1800s, when that's one way that a woman would measure her fortune, making the right match. And we read on to discover which. That's the effect on the reader. Okay, so I've written about 3 bullet points. I've made my 3 points. I've managed to write about sentences, and therefore I ought to be able to get 100%. Oh yes, and I've also used that word focus, which is what the examiner told me to. There it is. So let's see how I've done. This is the description of the top band, which is band 4. Have I been detailed? Yes, I've written long paragraphs for each bullet point. Have I been perceptive? Well, I certainly hope so. And I've written about structural features each time. Yes, I've written about the structural features. I give myself a tick. Have I had a range of examples? Well, I've got 3 of them, which I'm guessing is what the examiner is going to have. But have I used terminology? Well, no, I haven't really, have I? What on earth do they mean by subject-specific terminology when you're talking about structure? Really, you're just going to talk about paragraphs, aren't you, or openings and endings? That's not really specific terminology, so I'm a bit mystified as to what this might be. Right, the good news is that the examiner's approach is, on the face of it, similar to mine. There are 1, 2, 3 paragraphs, 1 for each bullet point. Okay, well, let's see how they've done. The text about a journey is structured also to take the reader on a journey, from the general to the specific, from the outside to the inside, from the weather through the coach, the driver and the horses, to the passengers. Right, in question 2, I remembered to do this kind of 1-sentence summary about the overall effect. Now, I haven't done that here, and there's a reason why I haven't done it. The examiner here is assuming that that extract is a whole text on its own, but it isn't, is it? It's just the beginning of a novel, and then the whole novel isn't about a journey, or if it is, there's no way that you as a student would know that. So actually, this first part is something we don't know. The examiner can't actually write that. It's completely unfair. But this bit in green, that they're moving from the general to the specific, you will always be able to write about, unless it's the opposite, moving from the specific to the general. So that will always come up, and you will always be able to use it. I didn't because, well, I just didn't think of it. I thought of changing the focus because that's what the question asked me to do. There is also a constant reminder of the weather which permeates each part. The little drips of rain that came through the roof, and later the rain oozed through the crack in the roof onto Mary's shoulder. So the reader is constantly made wet and uncomfortable, just like the passengers. Well, that's not strictly true, but that doesn't matter. You're making a point about the structure. In this case, it's the repetition of rain. Around the middle of the extract, the outside and the inside are made to coincide when the old man opens the window. That's a very tenuous point, really. This also moves the focus of the reader to the inside of the coach, which is absolutely true. Here I've written in green, this will always be useful about the general and specific, don't forget that. The text narrows down to take the reader from the countryside of Cornwall, the wide granite sky in the evening which closed upon the hill, to the inside of Mary Yellen's head as she contemplates the weather and hopes for a momentary trace of blue heaven. Well, here I think the examiner's missed the point, concentrating on the weather, whereas it's actually her fortune she's thinking about. But the good news is you can write gibberish like this and still get the mark, because you're talking about a change of focus, which is how it narrows down. But the reason I object to this is it's just telling us what's in her head. It's not telling us about the effect on the reader, this idea of us making predictions. So I'm not happy with the examiner's answer. I don't think it does what the assessment criteria says, but the good news is I think my answer probably does, although it's missing this overall summary idea. You'll remember I was worried about the idea of using specific terminology when writing about structure, and the only terminology I can find is this. The examiner's calling it a text, calling it an extract, and then deciding that the text narrows down. That's quite clumsy actually, but whichever way you look at it, the idea of needing to focus on subject-specific vocabulary is obviously a bit of a red herring. The bad news, of course, is that the exam board might spot this and suddenly want particular kinds of vocabulary, subject-specific words, to be included. But at the minute, these will do. Reading the examiner's response prompts a few more questions, though. You'll notice that there were a lot of quotations in it. Do we need to quote if writing about structure? The literal answer is no, you don't. However, if the examiners keep using quotations, then the answer is yes. So we'll have a look in a minute at band 3 that scores lower. If they're also quoting in band 3, then I'm afraid that's something we're going to have to learn to do, even though we're writing about structure, not language. Are there really technical terms about structure? I don't think they are, as long as you remember to call it a text, passage, a novel, and if it's from a novel, don't call it a poem or a play. Is the examiner writing like any student you know? Well, the answer to that is no. But does this matter? No, I don't think it does, because you'll be rewarded for whatever you write, as long as you relate it to structure and the effect on the reader. Right, let's look at that band 3 answer. Here we go. The main structure of the story, which begins with the weather, moves from the outside with the rain and wind that came in gusts, and which includes the driver and horses, to the inside of the coach and the individual characters who are the passengers. So I've got a problem there, because that is another one of these overall statements about the whole structure of the whole passage. So it looks like the examiner's expecting candidates to do that even at this lower level. You're going to have some overall comment. Right, next, the reader is able to understand the extremity of the weather and then go inside to the relative calm and meet the passengers. Well, that's clearly wrong. We've got this seemingly mad old gentleman opening the coach door, letting in all the rain, screaming at the driver about him being a rogue and a murderer. Not exactly relative calm, but you'll still get the marks because you're contrasting what's going on inside the carriage to the weather outside. In other words, you can get the marks even if you're completely wrong. As the extract develops, it changes the focus from the weather to the driver, and then the horses, and then the coach, then the passengers. Well, no marks yet, but now he's going to link it, or she's going to link it, to the reader's experience. The reader's experience narrows down to Mary Yellen, whose thoughts take the reader back to the weather. So I've got a few problems with this. It's not a story, is it? this is just an extract from the beginning of a novel. So we can't talk about it being the structure of a story as though this whole extract was a story on its own. And it completely ignores this idea about the murderer being yelled. What this tells me is the examiner can't think like a student who's not very good. They've had to make up an answer that's not very good, and they simply can't do it. The bad news is, although the examiner is going to reward you even though you write rubbish, they're still going to want this opening, which is a summary of the whole passage as a whole. Again, you would never do this when you were writing A-level. You'd go straight into the detail. Same at university. The only reason to do this is to get the extra marks that you need in the exam. It's purely an exam skill, not an English skill. So even though I've got a degree in English and I'm fully confident that my writing deserves a top mark, it's probably not going to get it. And let's look at the reasons why. The examiner wants us to begin with an overall statement that sums up the structure of the whole text, even though they won't ask you to do this in the question. It looks like they expect you to do it. It's very likely that this will always be A, moving from the general to the specific, or B, moving from the specific to the general. Now, I didn't make that point. I did talk about the change of focus, which is another way of saying this, but we can steal this idea because it will always be true of any text. So we'll always be able to use this language and hopefully force the examiners to give us the marks. And then the other three things I've got, I remember to use the word focus, I wrote at least 3 paragraphs, and I did include at least one quotation, even though this doesn't seem necessary. Although my answer included far fewer quotations than the examiners did in Band 4. So, once again, you can see that at least 50% of the marks are not for how good you are at English, but for how good you are at following the examiner's rules. Why 50%? Well, because I didn't do that, and I only half did that, which is exactly 50% of the things that the examiner did. So, I hope this video has shown you how to get 100%. And finally, just to remind myself and you about that need for the overall summary, here is a Band 2, Level 2 answer. The writer writes about the weather in the first paragraph, which makes the reader feel they were there in the cold and rain. You'll notice no overall summary, which is a big clue that that's going to put you and me in Band 2. Now obviously the examiner will choose a best fit, but clearly I'm not going to get into a Band 4, simply because I did not know the unspoken rules of the exam. Now, as with my other videos, I'll contact AQA and see if my interpretation is correct, and then I'll update you by adding to this video. Hope you found it useful.